Well, thanks for joining us for the Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. I'm your host, Peter Slen. Our guest this week is Louis Ferrante, a former member of the Gambino mafia family who's written a history of the American mafia. That podcast begins in a moment.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Now streaming on Peacock.
By all that's holy, Bridget Jones.
Hello, old friend.
Bridget Jones is back.
We are about to embark on an adventure.
For one final chapter.
Anything else I can help with?
Yes.
Experience every moment.
Do you think about what might have been?
And fall in love.
To Bridget.
All over again.
It's time to live.
Bridget Jones, Mad About the Boy. Streaming now only on Peacock.
Well, Louis Ferrante spent 8 years in prison because, as he says, he wasn't a rat. His crimes were related to his work with the Gambino mafia family. And now he's written a history of the American mafia. In the first part of our two-part interview with Mr. Ferrante, he looks back at the development of the American mafia, its key leaders, and what he sees as the mob's involvement in the Kennedy assassination. The first part of our conversation with Louis Ferrante begins now. Louis Ferrante, when you use the term mafia, mob, or Cosa Nostra, are those interchangeable terms?
They are, in the book especially, because the reader has to have accessible terms. To us, when I was involved in the life, it was more specific. We wouldn't necessarily use those terms. We would say the Borgata or the Brigade, or, for example, if it was John Gotti's Gambino crime family, we would say John's crew. Vincent Chingiganti was the boss of the Genovese family. He was from the west side of Manhattan. That's where his headquarters and where he lived with his mother. So we would refer to him, his crew, his family as the west side. So we wouldn't naturally use those terms. They wouldn't roll off of our tongue very often. But for the book, for the sake of the book and the readers out there, yes, the terms are interchangeable.
Well, what is a Borgata?
A Borgata is like, if you could imagine, we're probably more familiar with the term barrio, which is usually like, a Spanish neighborhood. We think of it as more of like a low-income Spanish neighborhood, the barrios. And that the Borgata would be the Italian equivalent of that, the original. But it morphed into, we would say a Borgata or a Brigade, we would say, when you're in the life, meaning our small, close-knit society, our small, close-knit crew. But it originally came from, as I said, usually like the term barrio that the Spanish would use. Borgata would be the Italian usage.
And who are the titans we're talking about in this book?
The titans are the main titans. One of them adorns the cover of the book, which is Carlos Marcello, the Louisiana Don Carlos Marcello, who locks horns with Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy, when he becomes Attorney General for his brother John, Bobby Kennedy also has other enemies, other arch enemies that are also considered titans in the book. One would be J. Edgar Hoover, the long-running FBI director. Another would be Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamster leader, union leader, working man, sort of industrial labor racketeer / union leader. And then there were other titans. Joe Profaci was an old mafia don. He is confronted with a rebellion from the lower ranks within his Borgata, led by the Gallo brothers, Larry and Joe Gallo. They would be three titans, Larry and Joey, against Joe Profaci. There would be three more titans. So that all of these are big, powerful characters, powerful men that basically lock horns in Volume 2 of the Borgata trilogy.
And for the purpose of this interview, what's a good working definition for us for the mafia?
An underworld society completely obsessed with profits. I guess that would be the best definition off the top of my head. And by any means.
And how did it develop?
it developed. I traced the development of the mafia in volume 1 of the Borgata trilogy, which came about in Sicily. And I wanted to get deep into the socioeconomic roots of the mafia, where it began, where it first appeared. And to the best of my recollection, a lot of historians said, oh, it comes from the Middle Ages. And I found no evidence to support that. The best evidence I found was that after the unification of Italy in the 1860s, Sicily was engulfed into the nation, the new nation of Italy, when the peninsula, which formerly was comprised of city-states, Florence, Venice, Tuscany, etc., it becomes a unified Italy, and Sicily is sucked into this. And at some point or another, Sicily felt like Italy was just another overlord. They had already been ruled by the Spanish. They had been ruled by throughout history. Different the Vandals, the Goths had been there. The French had been there, the Austrians, and they felt that Italy was just another overlord, basically ruling them. So they rebelled against this rule from Italy. Originally, the government was originally based in Turin, eventually Rome, and the mafia started to emerge. The idea of the mafia, it started to become like these people from different piazzas and villages, they had a certain way of life, and they felt like that way of life was threatened by this new overlord, Italy. And they began to form their own secret societies. And I traced the formation of these secret societies to the secret societies of Europe that overthrew the ancient regimes. Specifically in Italy, Mazzini, who became the father of Italy, was head of the Sons of Italy, and the Delphi and different sects of secret societies that wanted to eject the Austrians from northern Italy and the French from southern Italy. So the mafia adopted a lot of those secret codes, secret ways of life, and ways of doing things. And I trace all that in volume 1 of the mafia of the history. And then in volume 2, by the end of volume 1, I should say, they've migrated to the United States. A lot of the Sicilians, when we were in desperate need in the United States of cheap labor, a lot of the southern Italians who were poverty-stricken, most of southern Italy, including Sicily, were poverty-stricken, and they got on ships and they came here, including my own grandparents, and they came here looking for a better life. And a lot of the mafiosos in Italy rode the honest immigrant waves. My grandparents were honest immigrants, but on those boats, they were filled with honest immigrants looking for a better way of life, but also mafiosos who said, let's go there and plant flags. And that's how the mafia picked up in America.
Is it a pretty strong structure with lots of rules?
It is. And you have to know the rules and learn the rules. It could be best said, if you were to name the rules, you could probably name them on one hand. Don't snitch, don't betray your friends, don't talk to law enforcement, don't sleep with someone else's wife. These are things that that are just basically known. But there are a lot of other rules. It's almost like there are 10 commandments in the Old Testament, but the Orthodox Jewish community has 613 rules that they go by. So there's a lot of stuff that's out there beyond the original 10 commandments, and it's the same. You learn that on the street. What you can do here, what you could do as far as if I hijack a truck, for example, I have to be careful whose truck I hijack. If someone owns that trucking company and he's involved in my world, he may be offended. So that's another rule that might not be written, but you have to learn it. There are rules when you go to a sit down. If you go to a sit down, you're not allowed to bring a weapon. You're not allowed to bring a gun. You're not allowed to bring a knife. If somebody sees a gun on you, that could cost you your life. That's not a written rule, but you learn that when as you're involved in that life. So it's definitely a learning curve from the moment I got involved in the life until I went to prison. That whole time, you spend every day amongst around old timers that are basically teaching you the life through example.
What is a sit down, Mr. Ferrante?
A sit down is the mafia's brilliant way of negotiating an end to otherwise volatile issues and problems. So, for example, if for all the killing the mafia does, and it seems like they do kill a lot, because when they do kill, the bodies turn up on the street or someone goes missing. For example, Jimmy Hoffa, when he disappeared. But a lot of the issues and problems on the street on a day-to-day basis are resolved through sit-downs. So, for example, if I did using the example of if I hijacked a truck that belonged to someone else, if that someone else in my world finds out that I had hijacked a truck from his company, he may be after my head. He's mad. He's angry. I insulted him. I disrespected him. So maybe there's a sit down involved. He doesn't come looking for me. He knows I'm with someone else who's equal to him. So then I would either try to resolve it on my level, and if it couldn't get resolved on my level, then it goes up to the captains. And then my captain would talk to him or his captain, and then they would try to resolve it on that level. And if it couldn't be resolved on that level, eventually it goes to the bosses. But 99% of the time, it does get resolved on a lower level. You go to a sit down, you discuss it, you lay your case out on the table. I would probably say I did not know it was your company, truthfully, because if I did, I wouldn't have stolen the truck. And then he might, and I would tell him also too, I'm sure you have insurance and you're going to get paid for it and reimbursed. So there's no reason to look for my money. And he may just want an apology and I may have to give him one. But everything is resolved. We shake hands and we go our own way. And that's how the mafia avoids 99.9% of the violence that could otherwise occur.
In your book, Borgata, Clash of Titans, you say that there are about 5,000 members of the mafia, 50% in New York City. How do they have such an outsized influence for such a small group?
Yeah, well, it's through networking and associates. First, New York is the sort of if you think of it as like the Roman Empire, and I'm an avid reader from Gibbon to Livy to Tacitus. I love reading Theodore Mommsen. I love reading about the Roman Empire. And if you think of the Roman Empire, they had different provinces, and throughout the empire, there were different places where the Romans held sway, controlled, ruled. But Rome was Rome, and that's New York. New York is the Rome of the mafia's empire. So that's why most of the people are there. But just as the Romans would rule other places through associates, through relations, it's the same thing with the mafia, through associates, through networking, through corruption. At one point during volume 1 of the Borgata trilogy, there's a lot I do talk about how they infiltrated the various rackets, the various labor unions, and how they also got involved with government. You had Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, two mafia dons, at one time or another. They were from the same family, but Costello took over for Luciano at one point. Both of them with the 1932 Democratic National Convention. Both of them had, Frank Costello specifically had almost complete control of Tammany Hall at that time. He put in judges. There was a prosecutor who taped Costello's phone, and he received a phone call from an appellate judge, and he said, "Hey, Frank, I wanted to thank you for getting me that appointment. I appreciate it." And he says, "Sure, anything I could do for you." This is the mafia boss of New York who's appointing judges that are supposed to be overseeing these mafiosos' cases in court. And at that time, that was their heyday. That was their golden age when they had that depth of corruption. That turns around in a major, decisive way when Robert F. Kennedy becomes Attorney General for his brother, and that becomes Clash of Titans. That's the first time there's a massive concentrated attack on the mafia from someone who holds all of the almost unlimited resources of the United States government at his disposal. And that's when the mafia finally feels threatened. It's a life or death situation. But until then, they were incredibly deep in the American fabric of society, of industry, of the economy. There was at one point they had such a deep influence in the Teamsters Union, and when the Teamsters Union was investigated, Senator John McClellan of Arkansas, who headed the McClellan Committee, also known as the Rackets Committee, said that this is scary to me. He said that the Teamsters could basically stop the trucks tomorrow and strangle the U.S. economy overnight. And Bobby, who realized and understood the same, felt that, well, that meant that the mafia could strangle the U.S. economy overnight. And he did not like that. He felt that that was too much. And he dedicated his short time in office to overturning that.
Why were the unions such a vehicle for the mafia?
The unions were, it's interesting, the unions were originally infiltrated, specifically in New York, by a guy by the name of Lepke Buchalter. And Lepke Buchalter was, he was an industrial racketeer who was heavily tied to the mafia, specifically Albert Anastasia and Lucky Luciano. And they realized early on that they could mediate beefs between between workers and management. Very early on, workers and management would have these all-out brawls. People would be shot, killed, sometimes beaten with baseball bats, knifed, stabbed. And the mafia realized that, gee, if we could bring the workers and management together and come up with compromises, using violence, because management might call on the mob to help them, or the workers might call on the mob to help them. And then the mob at some point says, gee, why don't I step in as a mediator? And just as we had discussed this, the ideal situation is a sit down. And they would have now these sit downs between management and labor. And at some point they realized they were mediating all these beefs, and they're realizing that it's such a lucrative industry. Why don't we get involved in it? And the more times that the more they involve themselves in straightening out settling the problems, the more they realize that, well, in return, we'd like a piece of this. In return, we'd like a piece of that. In return, we'd like to get the contract for this or the contract for that. And little by little, they ensconce themselves into these major unions, one being the garment industry, which they controlled until my own day. In the 1990s, you couldn't drive a truck in or out of the garment industry without having approval. They pretty much controlled who made the dresses, the dress factories, etc. And Lepke Borgata was very, very intelligent in the sense that, for a street guy, he was able to figure out that the way he first infiltrated the amalgamated union was headed by Sidney Hillman, who was a well-known guy. He became, I don't know if he was Secretary of Labor, but he had a big position in FDR's cabinet at some point. Well, he wanted to get involved and infiltrate the unions, and he realized that the easiest way to do it, when they were resisting him at first, even though they had settled all of their beefs, even though they had ensconced themselves in the industry, they wanted more and more the mob. And through Lepke Borgata, he realized that he could, if he stopped the trucks and stopped the cutters union, the cutters are the people who cut fabric to make clothes, then he would have all of the unions come begging at his door. And that's basically how he infiltrated them, how they got them to bend the knee to him. And then the mafia eventually double-crossed Lepke Borgata, which I cover thoroughly in Volume 1 of the Borgata trilogy. And once they double-crossed him, he was sent to the electric chair. And a gentleman who went on to become a legitimate union representative went on to say that Lepke Borgata was petty larceny compared to the Italians that took over for him. And they ran wild with the unions after that.
Mr. Ferrante, you talk about being in the life. What does that mean, and what's your history?
We refer to it as the life because it is a life. It's a lifestyle. It's a life you're involved in, and it supersedes all other aspects of your life. There's nothing that comes first but that. It is your family. It's called a mafia family, and it is, quote unquote, your family. And I also trace the origins of that as well in Volume 1, how it becomes a family and eventually an extended family of associates. And what it meant to me was I probably will never I'll probably never see the bonds that I had when I was involved in that world. I don't say that I regret leaving that world. I don't say that I wish that I was back involved in that world, but I will say that I will never experience those bonds equal to that. And it was a family. These are people you could rely on. They're friends. If you called me in the middle of the night, 3:00 in the morning, and you needed something, somebody in your family, let's say your immediate family, was hurt, I would literally run out the door at any time of day or night, and that's what you're expected to do. And people did that for me as well. People went to bat for you. You went to bat for them. You stuck up for them. It's your family, and that comes first. And there's all different. There was a mob boss who said about all of the different people involved who are in a family, just as if you're raising your own family. Let's say you're a father and you have 6 or 8 kids, and all these kids are different. One wants to go to school for this, the other one wants to go to school for that. One doesn't want to go to school. Another one wants to take on a trade and just learn a trade. Another one is a dropout, but ends up being tremendously successful in another area of life because he or she didn't take to that world. Well, the mafia family is the same. You have guys like me. I was a hijacker and I did heists. I was known for that. People came to me with tips all the time. They expected me to get it done. If I was given a tip, I would look into it. If it made sense, I did it. I had a crew that operated with me. I knew who was perfect for what job. And then there are other people who are involved in maybe white-collar racketeering, and they're involved with stock pump and dump schemes on Wall Street. Maybe someone else is involved with labor unions, as we discussed, labor racketeering. Someone else is in charge of the concrete industry, which the mafia did control for a long time. They got paid for every yard of concrete on any job more than $2 million, and they controlled that for a long time. Another friend of mine was a capo in the Colombo crime family, and he supplied all of the rebar for many of the skyscrapers in New York, including the World Trade Center. Then there was a Gambino soldier who was in charge of doing all the fireproofing for the World Trade Center. And we see how that went, by the way. But he was in charge of that. So there were different people for different things. There are people who are known for loan sharking. And a lot of these guys are loan sharks, a loan shark for loan sharks. So, for example, there was a guy, Joe Butch Carreo, who was known as being a loan shark for loan sharks. Other loan sharks went to him and borrowed money wholesale. So he was like a bank. And then they would then, in turn, let's say they borrowed money for a point from him. Then they would lend it out for 3 points or 4 points and make the middle for themselves. So there are different people for different things. And a mafia don has to really, really assess who's best for what. And basically you fall into these things. You do what you do is best. But, in other words, if it's not working, you're either going to go or you're going to go. In other words, they're going to chase you or you're going for good.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment.
What if Galaxy AI could turn your to-dos into to-dos? Unlock everyday simplicity with the AI-integrated Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra at Best Buy. Pre-order now at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
As a parent or mentor, you have the awesome opportunity to help a young person build a future. So if the future they want is in the military, take the time to learn more at todaysmilitary.com, because their success tomorrow begins with your support today.
This episode is brought to you by Tic Tac. Close your eyes and take a ride with new Tic Tac Citrus Adventure. Awaken your senses with harmonies of sour and tangy fruit flavors. Picture the vibrant trio of mandarin, lemon, and lime as each flavor mingles to create a refreshing symphony. Pick up a pack and dive into new Tic Tac Citrus Adventure. Visit @TicTacUSA on social to share the good vibes.
You found your person. Now let The Knot help you with everything else. The Knot connects you to the wedding inspo, vendors, venues, and planning tools you need to make your day totally you. Having helped plan 25 million weddings, we've got your back when it comes to every little detail like RSVPs, budgets, and more. Because your wedding comes to life with the connections that matter the most. Get started at theknot.com/audio. The Knot. Let's plan your wedding together.
5 families, which you talk about quite often in Clash of Titans: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese. You were with the Gambino family, correct?
That is correct. Yes, that is correct.
And how did you become a Gambino member rather than a Lucchese member?
When you're on the street, you definitely become acquainted with people from all of the different families, and you become close with some, not with others. You like dealing with some, not with others. And at some point or another, there are people you might take a liking to, they take a liking to you, and then it's a matter of time before they bring you into that sort of like that Borgata, that club. So I was dear friends with from childhood with somebody who went into the Bonanno family. He went into the Bonanno family through his uncle, who was a long-standing captain in the Bonanno family, and his grandfather, his deceased grandfather, was a captain in the Bonanno family. So that was where he gravitated towards. But his uncle who brought him in, I liked him. I didn't love him. And I was closer with somebody else from the Gambino family. And at some point or another, I found myself through just friendship, becoming very close with John Gotti's older brother, Peter Gotti, was a captain in the Gambino crime family, and he had a son, and he and I became very close. And through the son, I became close with Pete, the father. So that's how I sort of gravitated toward the Gambino family. But it was also a friendship. I was in and out of that house for many, many years, every single day. At some point or another, I saw, discovery when I eventually went to prison, where my telephone toll records went back and forth to that house all the time. But that's sort of like, they were like a real family to me. I'd lost my mother. My mother died in my arms. And I thought of Pete's wife as a very lovely woman who was always greeting me when I came there. These people become your own family. My friends who was with the Bonanno family, his mother, his sister, became very close friends of mine, like a family. If I went over there, come in and eat, and we'd eat. And these people understand the life too. They look out for you. They know what it's about. I was going on the lam one time. I went to my friend's mother. I went looking for him, and the mother answered the door. And I said, look, I'm going on the lam. And this is his mother. She's in her 60s at the time. I said, I'm going on the lam. I said, I wanted to find him. She goes, is there anything I could do to help? I said, yeah, I got a trunk full of guns. I got to get rid of them. So she says, bring them in, hurry up. And she looked both ways and, waved me in. And I hid the guns and then took off. This is his mother who's in her 60s. So, this is like, I had friends of mine that when the police and the FBI was looking for them, they hid out in a neighbor's house for 3 months, and they were just up the block watching whenever the cars came to his house. He was watching from his neighbor's house. So this was a different world. It was a different time where, I can't imagine that my neighbors would do anything like that for me nowadays. I hope they just pick up their dog poop when they walk their dog in front of my house, let alone asking a favor like that.
Louis Ferrante, what is omerta, and are you violating that by writing this history of the mafia?
Yes and no. No, in the sense, and I'll answer the omerta part first, but no, in the sense that I stood up. I faced life in prison, and I was willing to serve life in prison. I was in there for 8.5 years. I hired the civil rights attorney, William Kunstler, who was not only my attorney, but became my friend. And I fought tooth and nail to stay out of jail as long as I possibly could, or to get a lesser sentence when I went to jail. But I never ratted, I never snitched. And I was always offered that option. If I snitched, if I turned, I would be set free. And I refused. At some point or another, me and my co-defendants, we were given pleas, and the main informant against us went into the witness protection program. And unbeknownst to us, he had violated the program. So we didn't know that there was a weak case against us, but the life sentences that we were facing, eventually the government offered me 13 years on a plea if I was willing to plead guilty. But my co-defendants would all have to plead guilty with me, and it would have to be a global plea, meaning all of us. And they would get less time than me down the line in matter of importance. So we discussed it. I took that plea. And I said to the guys that I was in prison with, I was away with a lot of bosses and underbosses and consiglières in the family. Those are the highest ranking people. They represent the administrations of the different families. And I was very close with them. And I said to them, hey, listen, I'm changing my life around. I picked up my first book when I was in prison. I was reading, I was studying. I wanted to make something of my life, even if I never left there. I wanted to be smarter than I ever was. That was the best I could do, then I'd do that. And I started reading, I read my first book in jail, began reading 18 hours a day. And I approached these guys and I said, hey, listen, when I get out of here, if I get out of here, because I was still facing life actually when I approached them, I said, if I ever get out of here, I just want to be left alone. I'll keep my mouth shut. I'm not ratting on anybody. I never will. But I just want to be left alone. And how are they going to argue with me, given all the informants nowadays that just take the easy way out? It was very difficult for them to argue with me, and they wished me the best. I stayed in touch with a lot of those guys to a certain extent. When I got home, the ones I could not see, I didn't see. There were people, they gave me a list of members of the Gambino crime family. Federal probation officer did give me a list and said, you cannot associate with these people. I stayed away from them. But other people I knew I'd bumped into, and they wished me luck. They were fine with me. The things I write now and talk about now, I don't point the finger. I don't put anybody in prison. So they have no real problem with me. But according to the strictest form of the rules, I shouldn't be talking. But then again, nowadays, we've seen The Sopranos, we've seen Goodfellas, we've seen the Godfather trilogy. Everybody knows what the mafia is. It's not a big secret. And as long as I'm not giving anyone up and putting anybody in prison, and everything I had done, the statute of limitations is long gone, so nobody has anything to fear, I've been fine with people. As to the definition of omerta, I took a deep dive into that in volume 1 again of the Borgata trilogy, and I wanted to know where the word came from. And as I understood it, it has an etymological root in the word man and being manly. And the original Italians / Sicilians, they believed in men being manly in the sense that it's a man's duty to care for his family, to take care of his wife, to take care of his children, to keep his mouth shut and take care of problems without going to the law, without going to the police, take care of those problems that you might have on your own, even if that meant physical violence. So the original word, omerta, had a lot of things that went into it, the definition. And I did a really deep dive. I found traces of evidence here and there where the word is talked about. And I did my best to trace that word and also where the word mafia came from. Now the word omerta has been watered down to just keep your mouth shut and be quiet, be silent. That's what most people just think of the word as. But originally it meant, to the original Sicilians, being a man in every way, being a man in all that you do. There was a mafia boss in Italy once who was being tried, and the informant against him accused him of about a dozen murders. And he thought he was impugning the witness by saying, okay, maybe I killed a dozen people, but you never cared for your wife. In his mind, omerta, killing a dozen people, fell within the scope of omerta, but in his mind, not taking care of his wife, the informant not taking care of his wife, fell outside of the scope of omerta, and he was the one who was, in his mind, a degenerate, a bad person. So it shows you how in this mind, the mind of this man, how this code exists, and even if it's a twisted code to most common people, that's how they think, and that's how I thought when I was involved in the life. Now that said, you could have a girlfriend, what the Italians call a gumare, Gumare. It's pronounced gumara, but you still have to take care of your wife. Your wife is entitled to everything that a wife deserves. Again, it's a twisted code, but it's a code.
So for most of us, The Sopranos, The Godfather, this is our interpretation of the mafia. What's the accuracy level?
Very, very good in terms of The Sopranos in modern day. Now, The Godfather may have been more like the olden days, the old timers that raised me into life, a little more quiet, a little more low key, a little more ensconced in business and industry. Goodfellas, a little more wild. That was more like the people of my own era, very, very regretfully, because it was the decline of the mafia. Goodfellas, if you juxtapose Goodfellas and the Godfather trilogy by Mario Puzo. Mario Puzo wrote the novel. The trilogy was done by Francis Ford Coppola. If you juxtapose those two projects, it shows the decline of the mafia very good. As for The Sopranos, when I was in prison, I only wanted to study history, philosophy, law, the masters and mistresses of 19th century fiction. I used to love to read. I read all of these beautiful books, and I was expanding my mind and learning more science, etc. And the guys used to come looking for me in my cell and say, hey, The Sopranos is on, come watch it. And I used to say, I don't want to watch that garbage, leave me alone. That's what got us in here. Let's move on. And they said, no, Lou, it's great. They portray us really well. And I'm like, I don't want to know, I don't want to. Well, I didn't watch it. When I came home, I wrote my first book, and Lorraine Bracco, who played Dr. Melfi, the psychiatrist of James Gandolfini, was the actor, who was Tony Soprano. She bought the rights to my first book. And I said, oh, wow, I wish I watched a few of those episodes. I've got to catch up now. So I figured I'd watch a few episodes, have something to talk about with her. And I got sucked in, and I binge watched it. I thought it was excellent, Peter. I thought it was done really well. And in the sense that not only did they do the crew very well, they broke down how a crew is, how it operates, but also, too, just the home life, the domestic life of Tony Soprano. I was in and out of the houses of these people. I was in and out of the houses of the Gottis. I was in and out of the houses of Vincent Cingiganti, was the boss of the Genovese family. His daughter was one of my best friends and still is today, over 30 years later. I was in and out of the houses of the Arenas. Vic Arena was the boss of the Colombo family. These people, their domestic lives were identically portrayed by The Sopranos. And I thought that was really, really done well. For example, Tony Soprano's wife would say, I don't know nothing. I don't want to know. I don't know about my husband or what business he has. But when she wanted to get her kid in school, her daughter, she kind of let whoever it was, the principal, the dean, the guidance counselor, she let them know, you know who I am, right? Because she wants something from it. So, a lot of that went on in my time. Also, too, when I was in the house of, let's say, Peter Gotti's wife would be there sometimes with John Gotti's wife. And they would be having tea and a piece of cake or coffee and a piece of cake, whatever it was. I'd walk in and they'd invite me to the table, cut me a piece of cake, and I would listen to them talk. And they were very, very low key. They never talked about their husbands. And the fact that their husbands controlled New York, you would never know in a million years. They sounded like my own aunts and my mother, just talking about the family, their kids, their grandkids. And as opposed to the wives of the men I grew up with, who would jump if they didn't get what they want, they jump to right away. You know who my husband is? You know what he'll do to you? So it was a different world. It was a different attitude, even by the domestic standards. And I felt that was done really well in The Sopranos.
Throughout your book, Borgata, Clash of Titans, Mr. Ferrante, you use two identifiers. Number one, the crime family, Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese. But on top of that, you also identify by city. New York, New Orleans, Chicago, Vegas, Florida. Why do you do that? Why is that important?
It's very important. So specifically with the five families, the ones you first named, those were specific to Manhattan. And because half of the mafia was in Manhattan, was in New York, I should say, the lower boroughs of New York, there was a little bit of an offshoot up in Buffalo, a little bit of an offshoot in Jersey, but for the most part, the lower boroughs of New York, and they eventually bought houses in Long Island. But New York controlled most of the country through the rackets that they had earned over the decades. And so that's being such a big part of, New York is such a big city. There were five families there, but the rest of the country would be one family. So for example, the New Orleans was controlled by one Borgata, one family. Chicago was controlled by the outfit. You could consider them one Borgata, one family. Los Angeles was controlled by another one. Kansas City, another one. Detroit, another one. New England, another one. So those were all just one family. Philadelphia, another one. One Borgata would be enough to control the rackets that were going on in that specific locale. Whereas New York, five families had to figure out how to deal with each other because it was such a big piece of the pie. Everything goes through New York, whether it be a lot of the shipping on the Eastern Seaboard has to come in through the ports of New York. And Jersey, the New Jersey waterfront as well, and they infiltrated that. A lot of the big labor unions were based in New York. Eventually, Jimmy Hoffa was out of Detroit, and the Detroit Borgata, the Detroit Mafia, they controlled Hoffa, but they still had to work with New York, who had their claws deep into Hoffa. And the New York locals, because they were so heavily infiltrated, the Teamster locals in New York, they had a say in who becomes president. So Hoffa had to deal with New York because he couldn't be the Teamster president if he didn't. So there were specific locales throughout the country. At one point or another, there were as many mafia families as there were metropolitan areas in the country. Some of them eroded, some of them faded away, some of them remained. And as of today, the five families in New York do remain. And then there are a few other places who have a small Borgata that are operating at like a very, very short staff.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kann du Norsk?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic famous foods from restaurants across the country anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
In your book, Borgata, Clash of Titans, you spend quite a bit of time on the Kennedy family. And I want to start with JFK. I'm going to list some topics, and then I'm going to jump to the conclusion and let you tell your story. When it comes to JFK, you write about the 1960 election, Joe Kennedy Sr., the CIA, Allen Dulles, Sam Giancana, the Bay of Pigs, Cuba Missile Crisis, Carlos Marcello, David Ferrie, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, LBJ, the Warren Commission. Then I want to jump to a conclusion. And you write, quote, when it comes to Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald, this was the first mafia hit in history to be broadcast on live television before an audience of over 100 million people. How do you reach that conclusion, Mr. Ferrante?
Yeah, great question, and extremely deep with a lot of moving parts. If I may begin at the beginning, when John F. Kennedy, first there was the McClellan Committee, known as the Rackets Committee. And Robert Kennedy was a chief counsel to that committee. He talked John into becoming part of the committee at the time. John was a senator. And he and John, mostly Bobby, attacked mobsters across the country. He dragged them in front of the committee, and he browbeat them, and he humiliated them, and often was the case. And at some point or another, mafia despised Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy for being his brother and for being part of it. And they also went after Jimmy Hoffa and said that his union was infiltrated by the mob. So at some point or another, they finished with that committee. It wraps up. Bobby leaves the committee, and Jack Kennedy announces his candidacy for president, for the Democratic nomination for president first. And Bobby wants to be his campaign manager, and he picks up and goes off with him. Now, the mob controls a lot of cities, and they control a lot of the machines, the political machines that control the cities, and they have money. And this is something that you need for an election. So at some point or another, Joe Kennedy Sr., the patriarch of the Kennedy clan, Bobby and Jack's father, was very, very heavily involved with the mafia. And I don't just take that, my book is heavily sourced, I don't just take that from the mouth of mobsters. Also Kennedy clan members, Kennedy family members, Arthur Gore Vidal, who was connected to the Kennedy family through marriage. Or even people who were appointed judges by Jack Kennedy, they said that Joe Kennedy was always with the mob. He could not have operated his liquor company during Prohibition and after, or rather he was part of bootlegging, but after Prohibition, he could not have operated his liquor company without the mob. He always needed them. And he also had like a second-rate Hollywood company. He could not have gone and had that without the mob making sure that labor relations were always seamless. So he needed the mob's help. So this comes from a number of sources that Joe Kennedy was heavily involved with the mob. Specifically, he was partners with the mob in the Cal Neva Lodge, which was a lodge that sat on the border of California and Nevada, where gambling was legal. And there was mafia influence there, as well as Joe Kennedy was suspected of being a partner, as well as Frank Sinatra. And Sinatra was sort of a liaison between Joe Kennedy and the mob when he didn't want to talk to them himself, which he sometimes did. And at some point or another, they go to the mob and they said, look, Jack's running for president. We need your help. And most of the mob bosses in the country were persuaded that even though Bobby went after them during the Rackets Committee, the Kennedys were going to get into the White House and move on and focus on more domestic problems like civil rights for African Americans and international problems like slowing down the nuclear arms race. And they'd forget about the mobsters. This was a stepping stone, just as Governor Dewey, originally Prosecutor Dewey, went after the mob, eventually became the governor of New York, eventually ran for the Republican nomination for president against Harry Truman, first against FDR, then Harry Truman. And Dewey used them as a stepping stone. Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, he used the mob as a stepping stone during the Kefauver Committee, where he made a name for himself, a national name for himself. Then he ran for the Democratic nomination for president. So the mob figured, look, it's been done to us before, whether it be Dewey or Estes Kefauver. The Kennedys are going to move on. Let's back them. We'll have 4 easy years, maybe 8. Nobody's going to look at us. We got Joe, the patriarch, who we're close with. We could always get a hold of him through Sinatra or ourselves. Let's do it. So the mob decides, specifically Chicago mob and New York, decides they're going to back Kennedy. And they dumped a lot of money, millions of dollars, into the West Virginia primary. And that came out, and I make a strong case for it in the book, all the evidence I put in there, and it's all sourced in the back. And they then there were a few there were a few holdouts, though. One being Carlos Marcello of Louisiana, a Don, and another mafia Don, Santo Trafficante of Florida. Those two Dons, with also Jimmy Hoffa, who they did a lot of business with, those three people specifically, but those two Dons did not believe that the Kennedys would turn a blind eye, and they distrusted them, and they didn't believe it. They said, we're not going to back Kennedy. So they first decided to back Lyndon B. Johnson for the Democratic nomination. And when Johnson lost to Kennedy and then was picked as his VP, they decided to back Richard Nixon for the general election. So those were the holdouts, but the rest of the mob were all in with Kennedy. And they also helped him win the general election, specifically in Chicago, where they controlled the wards that put in Mayor Daley. And Daley was close friends with Kennedy. And they basically said, look, we're going to swing the wards and make sure that Illinois is a Democratic state. Kennedy beats Nixon here. And he just pulled it out barely. And there's a lot of evidence for that as well. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the FBI director, was listening to eavesdropping devices in which the mob talked about the money they were dumping into the Kennedy campaign. Now, the mob is nonpartisan. They have given money to Johnson, they have given money to Kennedy, and they gave money to Nixon. They don't care who it is. They just want somebody who's out for their interests. So they're very, very nonpartisan, just to be very clear. And at times Nixon took money from the mob as well. But at this point, Kennedy wins the election with the mob's help, and then he appoints Bobby Attorney General. This shocked a few mob guys, and they said, gee, what's going on here? But Joe Kennedy's still there. At some point or another, Bobby decides he's going to use all the resources for the United States government at his disposal now. As Attorney General, he's not only in charge of the FBI, but the IRS. He's in charge of every law enforcement organization is under him. And he decides he's going to go after all the mobsters that sort of like flicked the finger at him during the committee. And he's going to get his revenge. And he starts going after Marcello. He starts going after Sam Giancana, who helped win the election in Chicago. He was the boss of the Chicago mob, acting boss. So these guys are like, what's going on here? So at some point or another, they're all under indictment. They all despise Bobby Kennedy. And they try to reach out to Joe Kennedy. But what happens is, very, very sadly, I think it was the end of December, December 61, if I'm not mistaken, where they reach out to Joe Kennedy through Frank Sinatra, but he has a sudden stroke. He golfs a few rounds and goes home, and he's dizzy in his Palm Beach house and in Florida, and he's dizzy and he has a stroke. He suffers from a stroke, and he's basically an invalid after that. He can't help the mob. And Gore Vidal famously said, had Joe been around, he could have straightened out the problem with the mob in 2 seconds. Well, without Joe, who's incapacitated, they now have to approach Bobby directly. And Bobby, who gets approached by Sinatra, is incensed by this invasive, how dare Sinatra attempt to talk him out of prosecuting mobsters. And he goes to Jack and tells him, you have to disassociate with Sinatra from now on. He's got mob ties across the country, and I'm going after these mobsters. Well, at some point, the mobsters, if we rewind for a minute, they were approached by the CIA, not specifically Allen Dulles, but people under Dulles, who went to them and said, look, you guys were thrown out of Havana, Cuba. You had all the resort casinos there. You hate Castro for doing that to you. The mob had a cozy relationship with the former dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista. When Castro took power, he threw the mob out. So the CIA hates Castro, despises him, wants him out of power. And the mob always despised them. So the CIA figured, look, we'll go to the mob and we'll partner with them and let them eject Castro. Now the mob signs on. And at the same time, when Castro was persecuting dissidents in Cuba, there was a massive wave of immigrants into Miami, Florida, specifically Cuban immigrants, Cuban exiles. But they fanned out across the country. And a lot of these people, the CIA decided they were going to train them to then retake Cuba. So while the mob is trying to kill Castro under the leadership of the CIA, they're also training these Cuban exiles into militants that could go back there, invade the island, and take it back. So the first attempt was the Bay of Pigs. And John Kennedy famously said, look, we don't want anything to do with them, with the exiles. We have to hide our hand behind this. We can't be upfront about it. It'll look like a superpower is bullying a small island. We can't do that. So the CIA figures, well, we'll twist Jack's arm. He's president now. We'll twist his arm later. We'll get him to provide them with air cover. We'll give them the support that they need. So they let them go in. Jack okays it. CIA is good with it. The exiles hit the beach, and they're pushed back into the ocean, into the sea, like the Persians at Marathon, and basically, it's a debacle. They're begging for air support. They're pinned down on the beaches, and Jack says, "I can't do it. I can't give them American air support. Sorry." And they need him to knock out Castro's Soviet-supplied MiGs, because Castro's strafing the beach with MiGs. You got to knock them out of the sky. Jack refuses. He says, "I don't want America to look like we're involved in this." And to Jack Kennedy's credit, he's got issues with the Soviets in Berlin, East and West Berlin. He doesn't want something to jump out there. He doesn't want them poking their head out from behind the Iron Curtain and other places in Eastern Europe or in Southeast Asia. So he's thinking about the big chessboard, and he says, "I don't want the airstrikes." Well, the exiles become prisoners. They're incensed at Kennedy. They despise him. The mob feels like that Kennedy left them in the sand, which he did, for whatever reason, whether you agree with it or not. They felt that way. So now the mob and the exiles are sort of kind of like feeling the same way. And the CIA agents and the hawks in Kennedy's administration, who desperately wanted Kennedy to do something, are starting to despise Kennedy. And some of them said that his inaction was tantamount to treason. So now you have like a cabal starting to form between rogue CIA agents, the Cuban exiles, and the mafia, who all despise Kennedy. The next shot that Kennedy gets at taking back Cuba is the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we find out that there are Cuban missiles off the coast of Florida being put there by the Soviets. So now Kennedy's in a bad predicament again. However, the Joint Chiefs of Staff urge him, "Look, here's your excuse. We have the Monroe Doctrine. We can't allow them to put Soviet missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida with a range that could hit any city in America. We can't allow this. Let's strike. Let's send in the Marines." Jack is concerned that it could lead to a nuclear holocaust, so he backs off. Well, the Cuban exiles thought that this was the ideal opportunity to get back their country, and they're incensed once again that he's not moving. The mob is mad. They wanted Cuba back. So again, the reinforcement of the relationship that already exists between the exiles, the CIA, and the mob is strengthened once again. And at some point, J. Edgar Hoover, who also locked horns with Bobby, because Bobby, as Attorney General, told J. Edgar Hoover, "You no longer just walk into the Oval Office and talk directly to the president. You need to go through me, and you're going to do what I tell you to do." Hoover never had that treatment before. He always trampled right over the attorney generals. He never listened to an attorney general. Now he's got the president's brother telling him what to do. He's incensed. Well, he has all these illegal eavesdropping devices across the country, and he's picking up threats to the Kennedys that are being in mob social clubs, that mob bosses are saying, "We got to kill these SOBs. We got to get rid of them. The faster, the better. I'd like to go in there and cut them to pieces with a knife. I'd like to do this to them. I'd like to do that to them. We got to move." Then there's an FBI informant named Jose Aleman, and he's close friends with Santo Trafficante and business associates in Florida. And Trafficante tells Aleman that when they're talking about the upcoming election, Kennedy's second term, he says it's never going to happen. He's getting killed before November, and he'll be dead by November. And Aleman says, "What? What do you mean?" He says, "Well, he's got it coming. It's in the works. It's all going to be done." Aleman runs to his FBI handlers, tells the FBI handlers what he just heard. They run it up the chain to Hoover. Hoover hates Bobby. Hoover feels the Kennedys are going to get rid of him if they get a second term. Hoover's pretty much ignoring all the threats that the mob is making in different social clubs, and he's ignoring this direct evidence from a reliable FBI informant, Jose Aleman, saying that Trafficante knows there's going to be a hit on Kennedy. All of this is ignored by the FBI, and the CIA, arguably members of the CIA, may want it. We don't know. The final documents may be coming out soon, but at some point or another, Marcello reasons that he had been funding Lyndon Baines Johnson's congressional and Senate campaigns for a long time in Texas. And in return, Johnson was reliably killing bills in committee that never made it to the floor to make sure that the anti-gambling bills and stuff that would have decimated Marcello's rackets in Texas, being the Louisiana Don, by the way, he controlled Texas as well as a satellite of his empire. So he was close. He knew that Nixon would be better than Kennedy. J. Edgar Hoover had lunch with, he knew that Johnson would be better than Kennedy. J. Edgar Hoover had lunch with Johnson once a week He preferred Johnson. And eventually Johnson made sure that Hoover would be the FBI director until death. He passed that as an executive order once he took over for Kennedy. And Marcello starts the plot. Marcello, I believe, who first funds the exiles after Kennedy decides to not act. He quarantines the island during the missile crisis. But when he decides not to act, he basically then turns on the exiles and says, lock them up, that we can't have them as saboteurs anymore, sabotaging the island. He promised Khrushchev America would not stand behind any more follow-up invasions to the island. And keeping that promise with Khrushchev, which the CIA wasn't happy about, he basically starts locking up exiles in different training camps. So the exiles are now moving closer and closer to Marcello, who, when the government stops funding them, Marcello is now funding them. And Marcello is estimated to make over $1 billion a year in the rackets. So he's funding the exiles. And basically, he gets this guy named David Ferry, who's close with the exiles, who has contacts and has worked for the CIA, who's close with a former FBI agent, Guy Bannister. And he begins to plan what he called a triangulation of fire, where 3 shooters would kill Kennedy in a kill zone. And as the evidence seems to be, at least 2 shooters shot when Kennedy was in Dealey Plaza. I mean, anyone could see just from the Zapruder film that his head went back and to the right, which would be consistent from a bullet coming from his front left. And also the motorcycle cop behind Kennedy in that same direction was splattered with brain tissue. So it seems that he was shot from at least 2 different places, if not 3. We may find that out soon. But David Ferry working for Carlos Marcello, they were the main conspirators, I believe. And then somebody had gotten to the government at the very top, because there were a number of very interesting things that happened within the Secret Service. This man by the name of Gerald Bain, who was always on the detail with Kennedy from the very beginning. He never left Kennedy's side. He always rode in the front seat in front of Kennedy's car, in Kennedy's lead motor vehicle, in any motorcade. And Gerald Bain suddenly says, I'm taking a vacation. I'm not going to be there for the trip to Dallas. He ducks out. And then there starts to come a series of decisions from Washington to Winston Lawson, who's the agent underground, working with Forrest Searles, another agent underground in Dallas. And they start getting calls from Washington saying the bubble top's going to be removed off the Kennedy limousine. There's not going to be 8 motorcycle cops around the limousine. We're only going to go with 4. Pull 4 of those motorcycle cops and put them at the back of the motorcade. The 2 agents that usually ride the rear of the rear fender, there was a piece of metal standing out, a floorboard that they would step on, and they would hold on to a steel bar that was welded onto the trunk of the car. They said, we don't want those 2 agents on the back of the car. And the Secret Service agents on the ground, who were heroically and patriotically defending Kennedy's life, were asking the people in Washington, what the hell's going on? And when they finally get a hold of Bain, they said, are these real commands that you're giving us? And he said, yes, follow the orders you're getting. And they said, well, one agent said, well, what the hell is he doing in Washington? I thought he was on vacation. And then he said he decided to come back to work, but work out of the East Wing at the time. So it seems to me, and it may come out very soon, Peter, that somebody, perhaps in the CIA, a rogue agent within the CIA, got to this Gerald Bain, who then dictated orders to Winston Lawson on the ground. And both of those men are deceased now. Winston Lawson finally passed away a few years ago. Gerald Bain has been gone for a number of years. But I believe that may come out. Somebody got to somebody, because even the press vehicle, which was 2 cars behind Kennedy's, originally two cars behind Kennedy's lead vehicle, was bumped to the back of the line, and none of the press understood it. They said, well, we know how to snap pictures. Why are we being sent to the back of the motorcade? They didn't understand it. So all of these things that happened, even Jesse Curry, the head of the Dallas police, was confounded. He didn't understand it. Now, the Dallas police, many of them were crooked, and allowed Oswald into the Dallas police headquarters, which Oswald eventually took the opportunity when Oswald was being shown, when he was being transferred to a local jail. He took the opportunity to kill.
You mean Jack Ruby? Jack Ruby.
I'm sorry. My apologies, Ruby. Correct. He was with, when Oswald was in custody, Jack Ruby. That is correct. When Oswald was in custody, Ruby was allowed into the precinct and permitted to roam the precinct basically at will with a .38 special in his pocket. which is like, what? How, why are the police allowing Ruby to get so close to Oswald? And apparently there's this gentleman by the name of Seth Cantor. He was a journalist, and he was astounded that Ruby was just allowed to roam around the precinct and in and out of rooms. And he was trying to get a shot, these people think, at Oswald while he was in custody, and couldn't get that shot. And then when finally Oswald was being transferred to the local jail, that's when it seems that there were a couple of Dallas police officers who contacted Ruby, who Ruby knew well, who dealt with Ruby. And there was one cop who said, look, the whole Dallas Police Department, for the most part, was crooked. So, it's not surprising that they would have allowed him so close, a shot at Oswald. And that was the first hit on camera. If we could maybe say that Kennedy's was the first mob hit on camera once we get the Zapruder film later on, but it didn't come out till the 70s, the Zapruder film, the mid-70s, when a jury first saw it in a Garrison trial, Jim Garrison. But before that, the first hit that the public was exposed to was the hit of Jack Ruby killing Lee Harvey Oswald. And I mean, he's there dressed in a dark suit, fedora, 38 special. This is not a CIA hit in any way, shape, or form. That's a mob hit. The CIA may have had something to do with something in Washington, because someone ordered Jesse Curry to have Oswald be shown, where they wanted to first secretly transport him to the jail in the middle of the night, undercover. And they said, no, we want him exposed. We want the public to see him. And that was a crucial decision, once again, that allowed Ruby to get to him.
Louis Ferrante, where do you do your research?
I have an extensive library in another room in my house that's probably several thousand books. I do most of my research there. I have a tremendous library, but I also do online research. I do take trips to libraries, but I haven't been able to go to Washington for a while. But for the most part, archival research online, which is very easy to do nowadays if you understand it and know how to do it. And also I have an extensive library. I find out-of-print books. I'm constantly on the hunt for out-of-print books. And I was able to find quite a number of out-of-print books while doing my research for this trilogy. And that was able to help me because, a book falls out of print, but there's still priceless information in there. And I found some of the biggest gems you can imagine. And also, too, I'm a voracious reader and an avid researcher in the sense that there may be a book that maybe someone wrote a memoir, like what it was like in Cuba, when Castro took over. And there may not be anything that jumps out as a headline that it's going to contribute to a mafia book about the situation. But then, you read it, it's 300 pages, and you may find a kernel in there, a kernel of truth that opens up 5 other doors for you. So I was very much like that. If I found anything I got my hands on, I would read it and try to put pieces together. And I think I was able to put the moving parts together. I have someone I know who has been studying the Kennedy assassination for decades, and he said he felt that no one has ever put the pieces together as well as I did. And I think a big help in doing so was a lot of that research, where I found different things from different places and was able to put the moving parts together in one piece. And I think that may be borne out very soon if we get the documents, although I'm not sure if the most important documents may have been destroyed already. Who knows?
Louis Ferrante is the author of Borgata, A Clash of Titans, A History of the American Mafia, a second in a trilogy of books about the history of the mafia. This ends part 1 of our interview with Louis Ferrante. He has been our guest for the past hour.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter.
And thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. If you like this podcast, tell your friends, rate and review us, and follow us on social media @BookTV for more updates and schedule information. And next week, it's part 2 of our interview with Gambino family member Louis Ferrante.